August 1945. The Pacific War was gasping its last, though the women captured in its shadow did not yet know it. To them, the days dragged on as an endless grey. They had been marched from ruined villages or pried from collapsing outposts, gathered into compounds wrapped in wire and guarded by young men in khaki. These were not soldiers in the strictest sense. Many had been nurses, clerks, signal auxiliaries, even civilians caught in military zones. They carried no rifles, only the weight of defeat. Their uniforms were tatters. Their hair hung lank with dust and oil. Their bodies were carved thin by hunger, bones showing through skin like the frames of broken umbrellas. In the camp, dawn usually meant dread. The sun lifted heavy over the horizon, its light revealing everything they wished could remain hidden: sores on legs, lice in hair, the grey pallor of starvation. At dawn they counted their rations, bowls of watery rice gruel if supplies reached them, bitter tea brewed from roasted barley husks. Sometimes even that failed, replaced by a ladle of broth that smelled faintly of fish bones. But one morning in late August, the air shifted. Mist hung low around the barracks, heavy with silence. Then came a smell so alien it froze the women where they crouched. It drifted slowly at first, then stronger, carried on the faintest breeze, warm, yeasty, sweet. Bread. Not the hard brown loaves rationed in Japan, where barley and rice husks stretched flour into sour bricks. Not the crusts gnawed by soldiers in tunnels, mouldy and dry. This smell was rich, soft, inviting. The women looked at one another with wide eyes, whispers trembling from their lips. "It can't be. Perhaps they are mocking us." The guards moved with their usual brisk indifference, shouting orders in English. A wooden table was carried forward, its surface bare. Then came crates, pried open with the crack of spee, lintering nails. Inside, loaves of bread, pale, soft, still warm, were stacked in neat rows. Steam curled from their surfaces in the cool dawn air. The women's breath caught. They edged forward, suspicion and hunger wrestling in their bellies. One prisoner, no older than 18, clutched her friend's sleeve. "If it is poison, better to die full than to die hungry," she whispered. The others said nothing, but their eyes were fixed on the bread. An American sergeant drew a knife. Its blade flashed, slicing through the first loaf. The sound was soft, almost musical, the crust giving way to yielding white beneath. He laid slices onto tin plates, their surfaces glistening as a second soldier opened a tin and dropped a pat of golden butter onto each. The butter melted slowly, leaving trails of yellow across the warm bread. For the Japanese women, the sight alone was unbearable. Butter had been absent for years, vanished from markets even before the bombs fell. In Tokyo, in Osaka, in Okinawa, families had long since forgotten the smell of dairy. Now, here, behind barbed wire, butter oozed across bread as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No one moved to take the first plate. Fear held them still. The Americans watched with impatience, muttering to each other. Finally, one stepped forward, seized a slice, and pressed it into the hands of a prisoner. Her fingers trembled. She stared at the bread as though it were an artifact from another universe. Slowly, she lifted it toward her lips. The butter shone, glistening in the dawn light. She closed her eyes and bit. The softness collapsed against her tongue, warm and rich. The butter melted instantly, coating her mouth with a taste she had nearly forgotten. Creamy, salty, alive. Her throat worked once, twice. Then tears burst from her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She sobbed openly, clutching the bread with both hands as though afraid it might vanish. Around her the silence broke. Women surged forward, reaching for plates, for slices, for crumbs. They bit greedily, some shoving entire halves into their mouths, others nibbling slowly, reverently. A girl dropped to her knees, cradling her slice against her chest before daring to eat. Another pressed her face against the bread, inhaling deeply as if trying to drink its smell into her memory. Whispers rose. "This is not real. How can this be? The enemy feeds us like this?" Some refused at first. One middle-aged woman folded her arms, shaking her head. "It is humiliation," she muttered. "They want to see us beg." Yet even she could not resist when the second round of bread arrived, steam curling higher as fresh loaves were sliced. Hunger clawed deeper than pride. By the time the butter touched her lips, she too wept silently, her body shuddering as she chewed. The Americans looked on, bemused. To them, the bread was nothing. Baked in field kitchens by army bakers, it was mass-produced, ordinary. Some soldiers cursed the monotony of it, longing for rice, for fruit, for anything else. But to the women across the wire, it was a feast beyond comprehension. One GI scribbled in his pocket diary, "We gave them bread this morning, soft, white, buttered. They cried. Never thought I'd see the day bread made a woman sob. Back home I'd throw this stuff to pigs, but here they treat it like gold." The women did not hear his words, but they felt the truth of them. Each slice was more than nourishment. It was proof that the world was not what they had been told. For years they had heard that Americans were cruel, merciless, animals without honor. Yet here were their captors, slicing bread and giving butter, not with sneers, but with indifference. The irony cut deeper than hunger. That night, the barracks hummed with whispers. Some clutched scraps of bread saved from the morning tea. Most could not resist eating everything. They lay on straw pallets, bellies fuller than they had been in months, tongues still tasting the faint salt of butter. "I thought I would never taste such things again," murmured one. "It reminded me of my village," another whispered, "when my grandmother baked with flour before the shortages." "I cried," admitted a third, her voice breaking. "Not from hunger, but from shame." Shame. The word lingered heavier than the bread itself. For the first time, many realized that mercy from the enemy could wound more deeply than cruelty. To be fed kindly by those they had been told to despise was to feel the fragility of everything they had believed. And yet, as they drifted to uneasy sleep, one truth pulsed beneath the doubt. Tomorrow, at dawn, the bread might come again. The next morning arrived with the same mist, the same grey barracks, the same hollow ache in stomachs that had forgotten what it meant to be truly full. But now, every woman's eyes lifted toward the kitchen block at the edge of the compound. They were not waiting for the clang of ladles or the call of roll. They were waiting for the smell. It came slowly, curling through the wire like a secret. Yeast, warmth, the faint, sweet note of flour that had risen and baked in ovens, stoked long before the sun itself. Then came butter, sharp, salty, melting, carried on the morning air like incense. Women stirred, whispering. Some pressed their faces to the wire, trying to catch the scent sooner. When the first crates appeared, disbelief cracked once more into hunger. They lined up in silence, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the loaves stacked high. The soldiers moved with the same brisk efficiency as before, slicing, buttering, handing out plates. To them it was routine, another task in the monotony of guarding prisoners. But to the women across the table, it was a moment, but heavy with ritual. One girl, scarcely 19, cupped her slice in both hands as though holding a newborn. She closed her eyes, whispering something that might have been a prayer before taking her first bite. Tears tracked down her cheeks again. Another woman, older, gaunt, hid half her slice beneath her sleeve. She returned to the barracks with it pressed against her ribs, vowing to save it for night. But hunger gnawed too fiercely. Within an hour she pulled it out, the butter now hardened, and devoured it in frantic bites, ashamed but unable to resist. Each woman created her own ritual. Some ate immediately, slowly, savoring every crumb. Others rationed, nibbling tiny pieces, making the slice last as long as possible. A few pressed the bread to their faces before eating, inhaling the warm scent as if storing it in memory. By the third morning, laughter began to ripple through the lines, quiet, hesitant laughter, like a sound they had forgotten how to make. The bread had not been a trick. It came again and again. Each dawn was marked not by dread, but by anticipation. Women rose early, combed their hair with scraps of wood, straightened their rags, eager to present themselves when the bread was served. The guards noticed the change. They wrote about it in casual letters. One GI scribbled to his mother in Kansas, "We give the women bread every morning. It's just the standard issue, nothing fancy. But they act like it's manna from heaven." One girl kissed her bread before eating. Another broke down crying over butter. "You'd think we gave them diamonds. I never thought plain bread could mean so much." The irony was sharp. Soldiers grumbled about the monotony of white bread, craving rice or fruit or anything fresh. They joked about swapping loaves for cigarettes. One muttered, "If I see another slice of this stuff, I'll lose my mind." Yet across the wire, women trembled over each crumb, hiding slices under bedding, begging for crusts. What Americans scorned as boredom, the prisoners revered as saos, alvation. Some prisoners tried to resist. Pride flared in defiance. A woman named Keiko stood stiffly in line, refusing her plate. "We should not beg," she hissed to those near her. "They feed us to mock us." But by the fourth day, her resolve cracked. She reached out, hands shaking, and when the butter touched her lips, tears spilled unchecked down her face. Later she whispered, "I could not fight it. I had forgotten the taste." Personal testimonies etched themselves into memory. A nurse in her 30s admitted that the smell of butter took her back to childhood, to a single afternoon when her father had bought bread from a Western shop in Yokohama. She sobbed so loudly in the barracks that others wept with her. A younger girl wrote a secret note on a scrap of paper, describing how she kissed the bread before eating, because it felt like holding a piece of the world she had been told no longer existed. An older woman, bones sharp beneath her skin, confessed that she pressed the bread against her cheek before swallowing because she wanted to feel its warmth twice. The ritual became more than hunger. It became a ceremony of memory, each slice unlocking fragments of a life before war, before deprivation. Even the soldiers began to notice the reverence. Some grew uncomfortable. One corporal muttered, "They're making me feel like we're saints or something. We're just handing them breakfast." Another shrugged, tossing an extra slice onto a prisoner's plate when no officer watched. If they want it that bad, let them have it. Historical records would later confirm what those prisoners already knew in their bones. By 1945, bread in Japan was nearly extinct. Rations had shrunk to rice mixed with husks, millet, and even acorn powder. Calories barely reached 100–200 a day. Butter was a forgotten luxury, reserved for propaganda posters of a modern Japan that no longer existed. And while the US Army ran entire field bakeries, producing thousands of loaves daily, shipping flour and butter across the Pacific on supply ships. To the Americans, while bread was routine, to the Japanese prisoners it was proof of a world turned upside down. At night, guilt gnawed alongside hunger. Some women whispered that their families were still starving in ruined cities, while they themselves ate better in captivity. A nurse murmured that she had abandoned her younger brother in Nagasaki, unsure if he had survived the bomb. To taste butter while imagining him clawing for weeds in the fields filled her with shame so heavy it nearly choked her. Yet when dawn came again, she lined up once more, unable to resist. Propaganda unraveled bite by bite. They had been told Americans were brutes, dishonorable, eager to torment prisoners. Yet no torment followed the bread. Day after day the food came. No tricks, no poison, no mockery. Just warm bread, melting butter, and the strange, unbearable mercy of being fed. Some women confessed, in whispers barely audible, "Perhaps everything we were told was a lie." Others refused to admit it, clinging to silence, but their hands betrayed them as they clutched each slice with desperate gratitude. By the 10th dawn, the bread had become sacred. When the first smell drifted into the barracks, the women stirred like worshippers at a temple bell. They gathered not just for nourishment, but for a glimpse of something that felt impossible: dignity in defeat. And yet, behind every tear lay a question heavier than hunger. Why? Why did the enemy feed them with such generosity when their own leaders had left them to starve? The bread was not just food, it was accusation. The ritual ended each morning the same way. The women returned to their barracks with crumbs still on their lips, their bodies trembling not with fear but with confusion. They lay down on straw pallets, staring into the rafters, clutching the memory of butter's taste. Sleep came late, fitful, haunted by questions they could not answer, for now the bread silenced hunger. But it awakened something else far more dangerous: doubt. By September, the routine had woven itself into the fabric of captivity. Dawn no longer meant only roll calls and the rattle of boots. It meant the smell of yeast rising before the sun, the faint shimmer of butter melting on warm slices. The prisoners no longer whispered in disbelief. They expected the bread now, though expectation never dulled the ache of astonishment. Their bodies told the story first. Faces once sunken filled softly. Eyes, hollow and rimmed with shadows, regained glints of light. Bones hidden under thin skin gained subtle weight. Women who had walked bent with exhaustion now lifted their heads, even laughed, quietly, but laughter nonetheless. The bread had done what speeches could not. It restored life. The Americans noticed. They noted the prisoners' improved health, the reduction of sickness. They wrote home in letters tinged with unease. One GI scrawled, "We hand them bread every morning. I swear some of them look reborn after a week. I never thought something as plain as bread could change people like that. It makes me think of home in ways I can't explain." Another wrote, "Back in Oklahoma, folks feed bread to chickens. Here, women cry over it like it's gold. War makes everything upside down." For the women, the bread was more than survival. It became memory. Each slice carried the taste of something lost: a mother's kitchen, a bakery on a forgotten street, a childhood snack long erased by war. Butter especially sparked tears. Some wept openly with every bite, remembering mornings when butter spread across rice cakes or bread bought in rare shops before the shortages. One woman, Yumi, recalled aloud the sound of her grandmother's wooden paddle smearing butter across bread in Nagasaki when she was a child. "I can see her hands," she whispered, staring at the melting yellow before her. She bit, chewed and sobbed until her shoulders shook. The women around her ate in silence, their own memories heavy in their throats. Not all reactions were soft. Shame often rose sharper than hunger. "It is humiliating," muttered a prisoner named Haruko, "to be fed like children, to weep before the enemy." But even she ate, her pride eroding beneath the weight of her body's need. Hunger defeated ideology. The irony pressed against them daily. Back in Japan, their families starved among ruins. Cities smouldered, markets empty, children clawing weeds from earth. Yet here, in captivity, they ate bread warm enough to steam in dawn air. Mercy from enemies tasted sharper than cruelty from their own leaders. Each bite raised an unspoken question: who had betrayed them truly? In the barracks, some tried to hold on to pride. They warned one another not to be softened by food. But each morning, when butter slid across tongues and warmth-filled bellies, resistance weakened. Bread did more than ease hunger. It dismantled belief. The guards, too, shifted. At first they laughed at the reverence, calling the prisoners bread worshippers. But as days passed, the laughter dimmed into something quieter. A corporal slipped an extra slice to a girl whose hands shook too much to hold her plate steady. A private carved off butter with his own knife, muttering, "Don't tell the sergeant." They too were softened by the sight of tears falling over crumbs. In time, bread became a bridge between captor and captive, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present in every exchange. Historical records show that U.S. Army bakeries across the Pacific churned out thousands of loaves daily. Flour came in sacks stamped with American mills, butter from ships that crossed oceans with refrigerated cargo. To the Americans, this was logistics, numbers, routine. To the prisoners, it was miracle. Statistics turned into taste, calorie counts into salvation. By mid-September, whispers of surrender reached the compound. The war was over, they said. Japan had fallen. The emperor's voice had spoken. The women sat stunned, unable to process. For years they had been told death before surrender was honorable, that capture was shame worse than death. Now their nation itself had surrendered. The news might have broken them entirely, but the next morning the bread came again, sliced, buttered, steaming, the same as every dawn before. Surrender had not stopped the mercy. That morning the bread carried new meaning. It was continuity amid collapse, proof that life moved forward even as their world crumbled. Women ate in silence, tears streaming, not only for the taste but for the realization that mercy had outlasted the war itself. One young woman, Aiko, whispered into her slice, "I thought the world had ended yesterday, but this bread tells me I am still alive." The Americans did not hear her words, but they sensed the weight. In reports, officers wrote, "Rations to female prisoners continue unchanged, their health improves steadily, morale stable." Cold sentences that masked the revolution unfolding behind the wire. In decades to come, survivors remembered not the guards' orders or the barbed wire. They remembered bread. A woman interviewed in the 1970s said softly, "The first taste of butter, it felt like heaven fell into my hands." Another laughed through tears. "They hated the bread, the soldiers. We treasured every crumb. That irony has never left me." A third whispered, voice breaking even after 30 years. "I wept, not for hunger, but because it proved we had been lied to. Our enemies were kinder than our own." The bread became testimony, proof that humanity survived even in war's cruelty, proof that mercy could pierce lies more sharply than bullets. On the final morning of captivity, when orders came for transport, the women were gathered as always. Plates were set before them, bread, butter, steam rising in dawn air. They ate slowly, reverently, aware it might be the last time. Some wrapped crusts in cloth scraps, determined to carry memory with them beyond the camp. When the gates opened and trucks waited, they walked out not only as prisoners, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the unbearable paradox that in defeat they had been given life, that in captivity they had been shown mercy, that in bread and butter at dawn they had glimpsed a truth larger than war. At dawn, butter melted into bread, and women who had been hollowed by war wept as if the taste itself were salvation. They had expected chains, humiliation, cruelty. Instead, they found mercy in the simplest of forms. The bread filled their bellies, but it did more. It dismantled belief, it softened hatred, it revealed betrayal. Each slice was not just food, but evidence that the enemy could choose humanity. For those who lived to tell the story, bread and butter at dawn became the memory that outlasted gunfire and bombs. And so the war ended not only with surrender, but with a taste, soft, warm, melting on the tongue, that proved mercy could be stronger than pride, and that survival sometimes begins with nothing more than a loaf of bread passed across a table at sunrise.